Another matter regarding the portion we've just read in Exodus is the fact that Moses, for some reason, gets appointed twice to deliver God's message to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites to freedom. Once at the burning bush, this is in Exodus 3 to Exodus 4, verse 17, and then again once he's in Egypt, in chapter 6, verse 2 to chapter 7, verse 7. The two appointments are similar, with God appointing Moses and Moses resisting and raising his insufficiencies as obstacles, pointing out that he's not the right man for the job. And God then, in response, having none of it, and solving each problem Moses raises and insisting that he go already. Okay? So the question is, why does this story repeat itself? Okay. Now, of course, we already know how the documentary hypothesists would answer solve this problem. Clearly these are two different Israelite traditions. One tradition has the appointment in Midian with a burning bush, and with Moses highly resistant to the appointment, and with Aaron as a minor character. And the other tradition had it happening in Egypt without a burning bush, with Moses less resistant, and with Aaron, the future high priest, as a central character alongside Moses. Okay, so the documentary hypothesis has two different traditions in Israelite lore, and different parts of Israelite society hold different traditions, and our clumsy editor just threw both traditions in there almost back to back, and let the readers pick the version of the story that appeals to them and reflects their own tribal tradition. So that's source analysis. But literary analysts, those who approach the text assuming it is a unitary work of literature rather than a patchwork of different narratives stitched together or placed together like a scrapbook, literary analysts understand this repetition not as repetition, the same story told differently, but as two separate events. Okay? The first appointment leads Moses to Egypt. Something happens, and then a second appointment is needed. So for the literary approach to be credible, we need to indeed see a dramatic progression from that first encounter, or the first appointment, to the second. We'll need to see that what happens in the second story reflects what happened in between in between the two appointments. So what happened was that Moses saw what happened between the first and second appointment was that Moses saw the mission starting to succeed in chapter 4, 29 to 31, when he convinced the Israelites to accept him, him and Aaron. So he saw the mission starting to succeed, but then he saw the mission crash and burn in Exodus 5, as instead of God using his mighty hand to deliver the people from slavery, Pharaoh used his mighty hand to crush the Israelites under an even harsher burden of forced labor. Okay? So badly was the Israelites suffering at this point, that they wanted no part of Moses and Aaron anymore. If you look at chapter 5, 20 to 23. Okay, they've had enough of them. They brought this this calamity on the Israelites. Okay, so not only has Moses not convinced Pharaoh that he's God's spokesman, but the Israelites disbelieve him too. Okay, they no longer see him as a savior, but as a false prophet and as the author of their destruction in even harsher enslavement than before. Okay? Moses gets cold feet. Now, again, this is after the first appointment, before the second appointment, because he sees the mission failing. So he gets cold feet, telling God that he's done more harm than good. This is in 5:22-23. But God reassures him that this is all part of the original plan, that he really is God, that God really is God, rather than some figment of Moses' imagination. And God reasserts his commitment to the Israelites, saying, I owe them based on my promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I have heard their wailing and suffering, and I will deliver them to freedom. And God then re-instructs Moses, as he had done before, on what to do at Pharaoh's palace. At which point, again, Moses repeats his routine, that we saw in the burning bush, about him being a poor public speaker. Okay. So when this dramatic development is taken into account, the various differences between the first and second appointment make complete sense. Not as a repetition, but as a progression. In the first story, in the first appointment at the burning bush, the poor public speaking is only one of Moses' protestations. He starts with, who am I to be a savior? In chapter 3, verse 11. Then pointing out that the Israelites won't believe him in 3:13 and 4:1. And only then does he bring up public speaking. Okay, in chapter 4, verse 10. Finally, after God answered and dismissed all his previous reservations, Moses persists with, please send somebody else, in 4:13. Okay, so that's the first appointment story. In the second appointment, Moses brings up only the public speaking. You'll see it in chapter 6, verse 12 and 30. If this second appointment were really just a different version of the first appointment, as the documentary hypothesis suggests, then Moses would bring up the very legitimate question of how the Israelites, how to get the Israelites to believe me. Pointing out they won't believe me that I'm God's messenger. Okay, that's a serious concern. But if the second appointment story takes place after, is a second appointment, is not a retelling of the same appointment, just in a different location and different circumstance, but really a progression. If the second appointment takes place after the mission had commenced and then crashed and burned, okay, after Pharaoh put the screws to the Israelites, then it makes perfect sense that Moses didn't bring it up. Okay, why would Moses raise this concern after he and Aaron have already introduced themselves to the Israelites? Okay, the Israelites had already accepted them, but of course they regret it now and want nothing to do with them. Also, if the second story were just a different version of the first story, we'd also expect to have a scene in which Moses introduces himself to the Israelites as God's agent, coming to save them. The fact that this scene is absent in the second story makes complete sense according to the literary approach, given that it happened, that this introduction happened between the two appointment scenes. So that leaves the question of why does Moses reiterate his protestation about not being a man of words? Because obviously, if our literary approach is correct, okay, if the second story happens after the first, if it's not repetition but a progression, then why does Moses need to say this again? He already said it at the burning bush. And God already heard it and solved it and dismissed it. So the mission's apparent failure, okay, the crash and burn that happened between the first appointment and the second appointment, they practically demand it. They demand that Moses bring it up again. Moses prompts, Moses prompts the second appointment by telling God that the mission was a bust. If you take a look at chapter 5, 22-23. Okay, he tells God, my words made things worse for the Jews. Okay, and so God says, don't worry about it. Now you'll see me in action, taking my people to their homeland. We're now at chapter 6, 1-8, verse 1-8. So God tells them, don't worry about it. I'm going to go into action, take the Israelites out. So go, talk to Pharaoh. And that's when Moses repeats his point about being a poor public speaker. Okay, please do take take a look at chapter 6, verse 9-12. Okay, Moses is saying, I told you I'm not a man of words. The Jews no longer believe my words, so how will Pharaoh believe me? Okay, so again, if it's a progression, the fact that only that Moses reiterates only that complaint makes complete sense. It's required, given the failure of the apparent failure of the mission. And also, you'll notice that the second appointment story, in chapter 6:13-7:7, is not as detailed as the appointment story at the burning bush in chapters 3 and 4. Okay? This is because Moses doesn't need all the details about what to say and how to say it and how to show it and what's going to happen and in what sequence and where the Israelites will go, etc. Because he's already heard it before, and we've heard it before. Okay? Moses and we, the readers, just need a reminder, which is why God just tells him in chapter 6:30 through chapter 7:5, that what I said still stands. What I said at the burning bush still stands. Do that. Go to Pharaoh. Okay. Now, unrelated, another difference between the two appointment stories is the history lesson that we get about Aaron in chapter 6, verse 17-27. Okay. This is clearly a dedicated history lesson about Aaron. It's our introduction to the character of Aaron. It starts with Jacob's sons, okay, with the lineage of the 12 tribes. But as soon as it lists the Jacob's different sons, and as soon as it reaches Levi on the depth chart, it doesn't continue to the remaining 12 brothers, but instead it takes a detour. It follows Levi's line. It leads us from Levi to Amram and Yocheved, the parents of Moses and Aaron, but it doesn't take us to Moses and his descendants, but to Aaron and his descendants. Yeah, we already had this kind of intro for Moses when the story started in Exodus chapter 2, verse 1, when Moses was born, So the Moses intro, the Moses history, is much, much shorter on lineage and no progeny. But we've already been introduced to the Moses character. This history lesson in chapter 6 is the intro to the Aaron character through the lineage of Levi. Okay. So in terms of literary function, the history lesson about Aaron is an enclosed detour. Okay, like something you'd place in parentheses. Okay, so in chapter 6, verse 12, we have Moses complaining about his poor public speaking. Then someone hits the pause button, and we get a little flashback or a flash aside that introduces us to this Aaron character who is about to take an important role in the next scene. Okay? We're guided through Aaron's lineage and progeny, at which point the flashback ends, close parentheses, and we're back to the paused scene of Moses telling God he's a poor public speaker. Okay? And the narrative continues. So what's unclear is why this Aaron introduction appears here. Okay? It seems it would be more apt in chapter 4 when we first meet Aaron. Okay, so at the burning bush, we're just told that Moses has a brother. But we meet Aaron in person on the stage at chapter 4, verse 27, when Aaron meets Moses and they both introduce themselves to the Israelites as God's messengers. So it seems that would be the right place for this enclosed flashback about Aaron's lineage and progeny. But instead we get it at Aaron's second scene. Okay? So perhaps it's because this second scene is the first time in which Aaron does something solo. Okay? He's an independent actor in chapter 7, verse 10. So maybe that explains it, but I don't know. Okay, so that finishes that section with and deals with the 2 appointment stories of Moses. Now, in our next meeting, we'll focus on this episode we read last week about God hardening Pharaoh's heart and then punishing Pharaoh for his hardened heart, for his intransigence. It's a it's a difficult episode since readers are left wondering why Pharaoh is morally culpable. And it introduces several theological problems about the Israelite religion, and meaning about biblical era Judaism. So since you've already read the relevant chapters in the Exodus story, I'd like you to instead read an article by a famous political scientist named James Q. Wilson, who passed away not too many years ago, who wrote, this article that he wrote on the topic of moral blame and retributive justice. It's a great article. It's easy to read and comprehend, and easy to get drawn into, and it's not particularly theoretical, but very, very practical, given that it deals with actual crime and punishment in our own society, in our everyday lives. So you can find it on the internet. Just Google James Q. Wilson, and the article is called "The Future of Blame." Okay, like I said, it's an easy read. It's a fun read. It'll draw you in quite easily, and it's a topic that means something to everyone because, again, it's about crime and punishment. Now, Wilson observes that modern neuroscience is often marshaled to challenge old-fashioned beliefs about moral and criminal responsibility for one's actions. Okay, basically the neuroscience tells us that Okay? I don't control, and I'm not responsible for my sensibilities, my perceptions, my desires, my fears, my emotions, my reflexes, my impulses. Okay, my brain chemistry is in control. Okay, it's not a matter of will, it's a matter of electronic activity that is physical. It's, again, my brain is in control, not my moral self. And Wilson then challenges this assertion, suggesting instead that modern neuroscience simply reiterates age-old knowledge about human nature. Here he says this is not a new observation, it's a very old observation. Okay? He says that, specifically, he charges that claims about neuroscience bringing something new to the debate about one's moral responsibility for one's actions reveals not knowledge of new scientific findings on the neuroscience of the brain, but rather it reveals ignorance of age-old Judeo-Christian theology and philosophy regarding human nature and free will. Okay. So he's saying today's scientists think they're bringing something new, but that's simply because they're ignorant of 2,000 years worth of theology and philosophy. So to ensure that you are not ignorant about this age-old debate regarding free will in the Bible, let me offer some quick guidance before you jump into Wilson. So Judaism is absolutist on free will. This means that, according to Judaism, God is powerless against man's heart. Okay? There's a Jewish saying from the Talmud that everything is in God's hands except fear of God. Hakol bidei shamayim chutz mi'irat shamayim. Okay, and what it means is that God has power to do everything, but He cannot compel. He cannot compel your heart. Okay, He has the power to do everything in the physical world, but He cannot compel your heart to be righteous or to believe in God or to obey God. God cannot reach into your heart or your mind and change them. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, Christianity is a bit more conflicted on this because part of its theology is an insistence, it insists on free will, while at the same time insisting that God can and does transform your heart. Okay, but we'll let Christianity deal with that in the New Testament, and let Islam deal with it in the Quran. The Old Testament has a strong record on this. Okay? In fact, the Old Testament's insistence on free will probably explains the Hebrew Bible's unorthodox literary construction. Unlike ancient mythologies, the Greek mythology, Canaanite, Egyptian, Babylonian, Assyrian, which these ancient mythologies of the Near East focused on the gods' dramas. Okay, their challenges, their exploits, miracles they performed, actions they took, their victories and failures, their relationships with other gods and with humans. Unlike these, the Hebrew Bible stands out in that it deals almost entirely with human dramas. And the difference between other ancient mythologies of that region and this one, and this book, this ancient Near Eastern book, the difference might reflect the Bible's insistence, or Judaism's insistence, on humans' free will. The ability of the human characters to determine where the story will go. Okay, so human beings in the Bible are not pawns of the gods, or of God, or of fate. Okay, which is something we see regularly in Greek or Egyptian or Babylonian mythologies. Okay, instead, the people control their destiny with their own decisions and actions. We've already seen that the Hebrew Bible is not structured as a philosophy or theology lecture. Okay? Nevertheless, it does deliver philosophical and theological lessons to its audience. Again, not in the form of a stated philosophical or theological truth, kind of lecturing to the audience, but through cool stories about interesting people. Okay? And think of it, when someone lectures a certain philosophical message to you, okay, telling you think X, but in fact it's Y, you're primed by this lecture to ignore or resist it, because it's delivered as an exhortation. But when someone entertains you with a story, your intellectual defenses are down, and you're open to absorbing that philosophical message without noticing that you're being taught, okay, that you're being evangelized. Okay, so the author or filmmaker is teaching you moral or philosophical or theological lessons surreptitiously as he or she is entertaining you. Okay. So in the Old Testament, one lesson that Israelite audiences absorbed by reading a fun story about Joseph or David or Samson was a lesson about free will. Okay. You might have noticed in Genesis 1, in the first creation story, that the only act of creation that is not followed by "and God saw that it was good," this repeating refrain that comes after every creation, at the end of every day of creation. The only act of creation that doesn't get that is the creation of human beings. And again, that chapter is so carefully constructed, and this theme, or this repeating theme, is so repetitive that it can't be a coincidence that it doesn't appear after the creation of humans. Okay, it so blatantly bucks the established pattern in the chapter. Okay, so it's not a coincidence. Okay. Now, humans are the only ones in all of creation who are created with free will. Okay, in God's image. Okay, so God cannot say, cannot utter his usual refrain, "and it was good." Okay, because God does not know if it is good to have humans around. Okay, with the sun and the moon and the heavens and the earth and the sea and the fish and the fowl and the beasts of the field, God knows exactly what they'll do. Okay, because they have no free will. Their nature dictates what they will do. Okay, they're programmed to act a certain way, and then they do. They act exactly like that. But the whole point of both creation stories, is to stress that humans are not animals. Okay, our nature does not dictate our behavior. Okay, people can fight their natural impulses and desires, and people can, we can fight them or we can give in to them. Okay? And not even God can dictate what humans will do. Okay? People can fight God's will, and people can obey God's will. People can fight their nature, or people can give in to their nature. God can command Adam and Eve not to eat the forbidden fruit, but his command does not tell us whether they'll eat it or not. It's up to Adam and Eve, not up to God. Likewise, in Genesis 22, in verse 12, as Abraham lifts the dagger to slaughter Isaac, God tells him, "Now I know that you are God-fearing. Now that I see you about to kill your son for me." Okay, so again, God can command Abraham to do so, but God cannot know whether Abraham will indeed obey until he is actually lowering the dagger. And to the same effect, in Numbers chapter 14, verse 11, when the Israelites hear the reconnaissance report of the spies about the land of Israel and how fearsome the Canaanites are, okay, and how we don't have a chance against them, and it's a disaster, God expresses grave disappointment and frustration at the Israelites' lack of faith in him. Okay, so after all the spectacular miracles God had performed for them in the desert, he expected them to believe and trust that he would come through for them. Okay, but again, it demonstrates that God cannot compel their hearts to believe and to trust in him. Okay, so the point is that animals and plants and the sun and moon, they cannot anger or disappoint God. Okay, just like if you build a robot, that robot cannot anger or disappoint you. Okay? The robot and the sun and the moon and the animal and the plants, they do exactly what they were programmed to do. Okay, and that's why God is never angry at them. But humans repeatedly anger and disappoint God, because only humans choose to do what they do. Okay, God created humans with many moral defects. Okay, vanity, selfishness, callousness, envy, ingratitude, which we talked about, lust, violence. So he created humans with all these moral defects, and then he expects them to act morally. Okay, to rise above or to combat these moral defects. To help them do so, he gave them laws. Okay, he gave laws to Adam and Eve, and then to Cain's generation, to Noah, and now to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. Okay, but the only way God can succeed in this educational mission is to relinquish control of us. Okay, if we were God's robots or playthings, then our actions would have no moral significance. Okay? I'll say it's not that he relinquished control of us. He doesn't have control of us. Okay, and that's why he's engaged in a moral education program. Okay, so we're not his robots or playthings. And we know this because our actions have moral significance, unlike the actions of a robot or an animal. Okay, just think of Moses or Abraham. If they were compelled to obey God's will, then we wouldn't think that they're praiseworthy. The reason why we think well of them is because they made a choice. Okay, it's their choice that made them praiseworthy. So the Hebrew Bible is not at all ambivalent about free will. It insists on it. Okay, we see repeatedly that God is not omnipotent. He's not all-powerful. Okay, because in the Old Testament, okay, because God has no power to overcome the human heart. He has no power to, what I said. Yet in the face of this repeated message about human agency and free will, we have this glaring story about God hardening, God overcoming Pharaoh's heart. Okay, so it's a challenge. It seems like a contradiction. On the one hand, well, it is a contradiction. On the one hand, we have this insistence on free will. On the other hand, we have this clear instance of God forcing himself on this person's heart and compelling his heart to a certain disposition. So when you find contradictions, or a contradiction between two statements in one text, in this case about free will, and on the other hand about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, there are two possible solutions. Again, in any text you read, if you find a contradiction, the possible solutions are, one, there are two possibilities: that the contradiction is inadvertent, or that the contradiction was placed there purposefully. Okay, either it's it's inadvertent if the contradiction between the two statements escaped the author's notice. Okay, you don't notice as an author that, hey, this clashes with that. Or it's inadvertent if one of the statements is not literal but figurative or allegorical or metaphorical. Okay, so again, the author isn't aware of a contradiction because he's using one statement factually, and the other statement, the seemingly contradictory statement, is not factual but a figurative, a turn of phrase. Okay, but we, the readers, mistakenly see them both as factual, literal. We see both of them as literal, which is why we perceive mistakenly a contradiction, because we don't understand the author. So that's one possibility, that the contradiction is inadvertent. The other possibility is that the contradiction was placed there purposefully. Okay, so perhaps one statement is a lie and the other is true. Okay. That the author is trying to deceive the reader, or to create some sort of conflict purposefully. Perhaps each statement was written by different authors, reflecting disagreement between these authors. This is what we're told when we encountered the documentary hypothesis. Perhaps one statement was written in simplified form, okay, let's say for younger readers, whereas another statement is for a more advanced reader. Perhaps the author placed the contradiction, again purposefully, in order to draw the reader's attention to some problem. And I hope you can see that all of these explanations have been, we've come across them when we discuss the two contradicting creation stories. All of these purposeful, all of these examples of purposefully placed contradictions apply. We've seen them deployed in efforts to explain why the Bible has these two contradictory creation stories. So, so whenever you encounter parts of the Bible that tell you contradictory things, for example, free will on the one hand, but hardening Pharaoh's heart on the other, you'll need to decide which of these explanations best explains this contradiction. Okay, and we'll do our best to do this next time with regard to Pharaoh's heart. So take a look at that article by Wilson, The Future of Blame, and I'll see you next time.